Hey everyone, James from TeaDB here, bringing you another Inbetweenisode. So today, despite all this teaware in front of me, going to be doing a non-drinking Inbetweenisode and going to be talking about, I guess, a little bit of a beginner-oriented topic, and one that, you know, it's curiously less covered than I think it should be, and I think it's actually a fairly useful topic to just think about a little bit, and just the different sort of buckets that we put teas in the different categories. So going today to be talking about sort of like the categorization of raw pu'erh and trying to help define different types within raw pu'erh that are just useful to know, and so to separate those out. For instance, something like a traditionally stored raw pu'erh and a young boutique raw pu'erh, those are so different from each other, they might as well be a different category of tea. So you saying you like one doesn't really mean that you, like if you try one and say, oh, I like raw pu'erh, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to like the other one. I mean, they're technically both raw pu'erh, but they're both very, very, very different from each other. So there's just a huge diversity within raw pu'erh. So I mean, usually, sometimes you'll run into someone that's like, oh, I don't like raw pu'erh, and then usually once you talk to them a little bit, you'll drill down and you'll ask them, what have you tried? And you'll usually find out that they've only tried one or maybe two of these sort of subcategories or categories of raw pu'erh. What usually happens is, for someone like myself, is I try to encourage them to try some of the other types of raw pu'erh, because it really is truly an extremely diverse category of tea, where we are drinking tea that's young, we're drinking tea that's sort of semi-aged, in between, we're drinking tea that's semi-aged with different storage, we're drinking semi-aged others, and we're drinking older tea or traditionally stored tea. So, nothing's going to necessarily subcategorize perfectly, but I'm going to do my best here to sort of define it as I see it, and draw some distinctions in different categories that way. And obviously, teas within the category, there's going to be diversity within that. For instance, one of the categories I'm going to talk about is sort of young boutique raw pu'erh. And boutique teas, kind of by definition, are very, very small productions. So, you know, you're going to just get a big diversity. It's like one Iwu tea could be very different from like a Linchong tea, for instance. So yeah, I mean, you want to get, you don't want to just try one tea from these categories. You want to try at least a handful of them. And yeah, this is also kind of like, we think about those like personality tests and the way they put people into categories. I think in the same way, it's sort of, well, maybe that analogy doesn't quite work, but it's worth thinking about these things and thinking about the different ways and the teas that fit into categories. And I can sort of imagine, you have some like those wine subscriptions or whatever, and they have like this questionnaire at the beginning, and they're asking you what you like, what you don't like, and then it helps to sort of fit you to that. And I can imagine something similar happening in the world of raw pu'erh, just because there is an incredible amount of diversity of flavors, profiles, etc. Okay, so the first category going to talk about, going to be moving young to old, is young boutique raw pu'erh. This is a really, really easy category to find once you get sort of acclimated to your Western vendors. Many of them have sort of like their own line. So we're talking like your Yunnan Sourcing, your White 2T, your Farm Relief, your Crimson Lotus. And of course you can find more like Taiwanese brands or mainland Chinese brands as well. So definitely try out some of those teas. Don't just sample the cheaper stuff. I think it's also worth trying some of the higher end stuff to see what's available. I think this sort of category of tea doesn't necessarily need to be like super well covered on this video. I think probably most of the people watching it are exposed to this. If anything, I think in the Western scene we tend to be overexposed to young boutique raw pu'erh, so I'm not going to talk too much about this. One other category you could look at that I'm not going to cover here because I don't necessarily think it's worth trying, certainly not worth trying I think for novice drinkers, is young factory tea. I think factory tea for the most part, at least certainly historically, is intended more for aging and to be consumed once it has some years under its belt. So I guess you could technically try something like 2021 7542. I don't want to do that. I would not recommend that upon anyone, but it could be an interesting exercise, but I don't think it's by any means required. Okay, second type of category of tea going to be talking about is semi-aged factory pu'erh stored in a humid place. So I'm talking your Taiwan, your Hong Kong, your Guangdong, your Malaysia. How old? Usually I like to look at least 7 years, anywhere between like that 7 to 15 to 20 year range. So filming this in 2021, so I guess at the very youngest, 2014. Personally, I would try to go a little bit older than that. If you can get around the 2010, 2011 or older range, I think that's good. And where can you buy from? Well, here's a couple places. Teas We Like, Yunnan Sourcing, King Tea Mall. All of these places have a lot of tea stored in Taiwan, Hong Kong, etc. So what are some sort of like reliable kicks? Dai, of course, is the biggest, most famous factory. I think it's the biggest. I'm not totally sure actually about that. So someone can fact check me. But trying some of their 7542 or 8582, which are two of their main sort of signature recipes, both very different from one another, so they can give you a nice little range of their taste. Teas We Like sells a 2010 version that is pretty good. You can definitely find some other ones as well. And 8582, definitely also worth trying. Teas We Like also sells a 2008 version of that, that you could also give a shot to. Not terribly difficult to find, being sold. Of course, dye is frequently faked, so that is something you want to worry about. I wouldn't just buy the cheapest tea that you see that's labeled as 7542. Going through sort of a trusted vendor or source can be helpful in that manner. So definitely want to try these teas once they have some more humid storage under their belt, just because that's going to advance the tea a little bit faster. And I think it's important to taste what these teas are starting to taste like once they start to get some of those more aged notes to them. Some other factory productions that I think are also worth talking about, with Shaguan, they have this green box you see here. One of their characteristic productions, not an expensive tea by any means, in fact cheaper definitely than those dais. So that's the Jiaji. Shaguan is known for their tools, so try something in the mid-2000s range. These ones I think were about $10, and they're from 2004 and 2005. From MXT from Taobao. You don't need to go through the trouble of going through Taobao, so just look up King Tea Mall or Yunnan Sourcing or somewhere like that and give them a shot. A couple other ones. These ones are more popular amongst the Western pu'erh drinking sphere. The Chongtai Tongxing Tong An, I forget what it's called exactly. TXTA is what it's abbreviated as well as the 65th anniversary. I think these are both available through King Tea Mall and Yunnan Sourcing. I have tried both over the years. I'm not a big Chongtai fan, but those are well liked by a lot of other people. So yeah, definitely give those a shot. So that's category number 2, and definitely one that I think everyone should worth trying. I think that's one that gets undercovered. There's a sort of in the Western scene, we get exposed to a lot of young boutiques, so you might think that's all there is to it, but this category is definitely worth seeking out, and it's mostly covered by, I guess, lesser-known vendors. So like your Teas We Like, your King Tea Mall, I think those are probably a little bit smaller and do less volume of sales than Yunnan Sourcing white tea. Could be wrong. I don't know. Not the important part of that fact. Okay, next is a semi-aged factory stored in Kunming. Personally, this is not my favorite. It doesn't necessarily need to be Kunming. It could be somewhere else pretty dry. I think it's worth having as a reference point against those other teas. So you could try any of those teas I just listed above, but stored in a drier climate. So your Kunming. Yunnan Sourcing, probably the place I would go for that. I don't know if King Tea Mall sells Kunming store tea, but if they do, check that out. Oh, one other place I wanted to mention as a place that's somewhat humid to store tea, Munghai. County, which is also in Yunnan, but is much more hot and humid compared to Kunming storage. Okay, so that is category number 3, semi-aged factory tea stored in Kunming. And you're going to find a very different profile than your Taiwan, your Hong Kong. I don't think you need to buy the exact same tea, like 2008 8582 from Taiwan versus Kunming. I mean, that's great if you can, but I don't think it's necessary. I think if you get enough reps with both of those categories, I think it's going to be pretty obvious to any drinker what the major differences are there. All right, and category number 4, semi-aged boutique. So I hesitated to make this sort of like one of the major categories, but I do think it's probably worth trying. So we're talking your Yongqing Hao, your Chen Yuan Hao, your Bian Hao, your Dragon Tea House. Of course, these Western brands could also start to drift into sort of the semi-aged category, your white teas, your Yunnan sourcings. I mean, kind of by definition, these boutiques are smaller labels. They are making lower volumes of tea, so it's harder to find sort of reference teas here. There's going to be a lot of diversity within them. But I think it's worth trying because these brands and these boutique labels do make a significant amount of the they suck up a significant amount of oxygen and just sort of what's talked about. And I do think some of them can be pretty interesting and quite good aged teas. You're definitely going to have to spend a little bit more than you would for your factory teas to try these. And there's definitely some accessibility issues for them. But yeah, going to Teas We Like, you can also go through Emmet for some Yongqing Hao, try some of those. So those are some like Taiwanese brands. With Teas We Like, they sell some Chen Yuan Hao. They also sell some Dragon Tea House, which is pretty different from those other ones, and Bian Hao. So you can find these. You could probably also find them through a place like King Tea Mall. Yeah, I don't necessarily have specific recommendations here just because these are smaller productions and you know, it's like there's going to be a pretty big diversity. Of course, Shiza Hao as well. If you're on the Taiwanese auctions, you can definitely find some that way as well. And they're just a sort of different category than your semi-aged raw teas, and I think they can have somewhat different trajectories. And I think some will age well and some will age kind of poorly in some ways. Okay, so definitely check that out if you can find that. And the fifth tea I wanted to cover is another one that is not terribly well covered in the Western scene, and that is traditionally stored tea. And I almost didn't want to talk about this just because there are huge accessibility issues in terms of traditionally stored raw. I actually got my introduction to this tea pretty early for a Western person, just because Tony from Origin Tea was one of my main sources for knowledge, as well as Pu'erh early on, and he sold a handful of these teas, and I got a pretty good crash course on them. It's a category of tea I liked. It's unfortunately a category of tea that I, despite drinking tea for 9 years and having been introduced to this tea many years ago, I don't have like a ton of sources for this. But I was recently told that Yi'an, which is a tea house in Hong Kong, which is really kind of the birthplace of this sort of style of storage, which is you should read Marshall's blog to learn more, but it's really a method where you are storing the tea very hot and humid for a few years, and then you're storing it more naturally after that. And the variance with the storage methods can vary quite a bit. But it's a way that tea has been stored traditionally for consumption. And Yi'an, Hong Kong Tea House, sells a lot of different teas. I have some teas heading my way. I haven't tried anything yet, but I've heard that these are, you know, fairly dank and good examples of sort of just this style of tea that is really significantly undercovered in the West. So I think it's really worth trying if you can get your hands on those teas. So shout out to Yi'an Tea for that. I'm going to be bringing on some of their teas onto the show unless they are a complete disaster, and I'll let you know my thoughts on those teas as well. So those are the 5 categories of raw pu'erh that I'm going to point out that I think everyone should try and sample from, especially newer drinkers, just to be able to determine where you fit, which of those categories you like. For instance, for myself, I probably like the last 4 categories of tea more than I like young boutique teas, although I can get into some young boutiques, but I do find the value proposition a little dubious for myself, just in terms of if I'm going to be spending $1 a gram on tea. I generally prefer one of the latter categories, even though I can find certain young boutique teas that I like a lot. Figure out what you like within the scheme of raw pu'erh. So 5 categories: young boutique, semi-aged factory tea stored in Taiwan, Hong Kong, Guangdong, or Malaysia or Manghai. 3, semi-aged factory stored in Kunming, so drier. If you like category 1 and 3, you might not be ideal for sort of aging, which simplifies your life quite a bit. Number 4, semi-aged boutique. Honestly, buy this from wherever. I think it's not an accessible enough category that I'm going to limit the sort of storage locations you can get it from. And category number 5, traditionally stored raw pu'erh. And the last thing I'll say about traditionally stored raw is you don't necessarily need to buy something that's super old. The whole point of this tea is that it accelerates the aging fast. I mean, obviously you're going to want something that's probably at least a decade old, but you don't necessarily need to be buying like 20-year-old traditionally stored raw. It's definitely not necessary. Okay, well, that just about concludes this In-Betweenisode. Let me know how you liked it. Let me know how many of these categories of raw pu'erh you've tried, which ones are your favorites. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to this question at all. So thank you all for following, and I will see you all next time.